Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung, Chapter 6, Confrontation with the Unconscious. After the parting of the ways with Freud, a period of inner uncertainty began for me. It would be no exaggeration to call it a state of disorientation. I felt totally suspended in mid-air, for I had not yet found my own footing. Above all, I found it necessary to develop a new attitude towards my patients. I resolved for the present not to bring any theoretical premises to bear upon them, but to wait and see what they would tell of their own accord. My aim became to leave things to chance. The result was that the patients would spontaneously report their dreams and fantasies to me, and I would merely ask, "What occurs to you in connection with that?" or "How do you mean that? Where does that come from? What do you think about it?" The interpretations seemed to follow of their own accord from the patient's replies and associations. I avoided all theoretical points of view and simply helped the patient to understand the dream images by themselves, without application of rules and theories. Soon I realized that it was right to take the dreams in this way as the basis of interpretation, for that is how dreams are intended. They are the facts from which we must proceed. Naturally, the aspects resulting from this method were so multitudinous that the need for a criterion grew more and more pressing, the need, I might almost put it, for some initial orientation. About this time I experienced a moment of unusual clarity in which I looked back over the way I had traveled so far. I thought, "Now you possess a key to mythology and are free to unlock all the gates of the unconscious psyche." And then something whispered within me, "Why open all gates?" and promptly the question arose of what, after all, I had accomplished. I had explained the myths of people of the past. I had written a book about the hero, the myths in which man always lived. But in what myth does man live nowadays? In the Christian myth? The answer might be, do you live in that? I asked myself. To be honest, the answer was no. For me, it was not what I live by. Then, do we no longer have myths? No, evidently we no longer have any myth. But then, what is your myth? The myth in which you live? At this point, the dialogue with myself became uncomfortable, and I stopped thinking. I had reached a dead point. Then, around Christmas of 1912, I had a dream. In the dream I found myself in a magnificent Italian loggia with pillars, a marble floor, and a marble balustrade. I was sitting on a gold Renaissance chair. In front of me was a table of rare beauty. It was made of green stone like emerald. There I sat looking out into the distance, for the loggia was set high up on the tower of a castle. My children were sitting at the table too. Suddenly a white bird descended, a small seagull or a dove. Gracefully it came to rest on the table. I signed to the children to be still, so they would not frighten away the pretty white bird. Immediately the dove was transformed into a little girl, about 8 years of age, with golden blonde hair. She ran off with the children and played with them among the colonnades of the castle. I remained lost in thought, musing about what I had just experienced. The little girl returned and tenderly placed her arms around my neck. Then she suddenly vanished. The dove was back and spoke slowly in a human voice. "Only in the first hours of the night can I transform myself into a human being, while the male dove is busy with the 12 dead." And then she flew off into the blue air, and I awoke. I was greatly stirred. What business would a male dove be having with 12 dead people? In connection with the emerald table, the story of the tabula smaragdinga occurred to me, the emerald table in the alchemical legend of Hermes Trismegistus. He was said to have left behind him a table upon which the basic tenets of alchemical wisdom were engraved in Greek. I also thought of the 12 apostles, the 12 months of the year, the signs of the zodiac, etc., but I could find no solution to the enigma. Finally, I had to give it up. All I knew about my certainty was that the dream indicated an unusual activation of the unconscious, but I knew no technique whereby I might get to the bottom of my inner process, and so there remained nothing for me to do but wait, go on with my life, and pay close attention to my fantasies. One fantasy kept returning. There was something dead present, but it was also still alive. For example, corpses were placed in the crematory ovens, but were then discovered to be still living. The fantasies came to a head and were simultaneously resolved in a dream. I was in a region like the Alki camps near Arles. There they have a lane of sarcophagi, which go back to Merovingian times. In the dream I was coming from the city, and saw before me a similar lane with a long row of tombs. There were pedestals with stone slabs on which the dead lay. They reminded me of old church burial vaults where knights in armor lay outstretched. Thus the dead lay in my dream in their antique clothes, with hands clasped, the difference being that when they were not hewn out of stone, but in a curious fashion mummified. I stood still in front of the first grave and looked at the dead man, who was a person of 1830s. I looked at his clothes with interest, whereupon he suddenly moved and came to life. He unclasped his hands, and that was only because I was looking at him. I had an extremely unpleasant feeling, but walked on and came to another body. He belonged to the 18th century. There exactly the same thing happened. When I looked at him, he came to life and moved his hands. So I went down the whole row until I came to the 12th century, that is, a crusader in chainmail who lay there with clasped hands. His figure seemed carved out of wood. For a long time I looked at him, and thought he was really dead, but suddenly I saw that a finger on his left hand was beginning to stir gently. Of course, I had originally held to Freud's view that vestiges of old experiences existed in the unconscious. Footnote: Freud speaks of archaic vestiges. But dreams like this and my actual experience of the unconscious taught me that such contents are not dead, outmoded forms, but belong to our living being. My work had confirmed this assumption, and in the course of years there developed from it the theory of archetypes. The dreams, however, could not help me over my feelings of disorientation. On the contrary, I lived as if under constant inner pressure. At times this became so strong that I suspected that there was some psychic disturbance in myself. Therefore I twice went over all the details of my entire life, with particular attention to my childhood memories, for I thought that there might be something in my past which I could not see and which might possibly be the cause of the disturbance. But this retrospective led to nothing but a fresh acknowledgment of my own ignorance. Thereupon I said to myself, since I know nothing at all, I shall simply do whatever occurs to me. Thus I consciously submitted myself to the impulses of the unconscious. The first thing that came to the surface was a childhood memory from perhaps my 10th or 11th year. By that time I had a spell of playing passionately with building blocks. I distinctly recall that I had built little houses and castles using bottles to form the sides of gates and vaults. Somewhat later, I had used ordinary stones with mud for mortar. These structures had fascinated me for a long time. To my astonishment, this memory was accompanied by a good deal of emotion. Aha! I said to myself. There is still life in these things. The small boy is still around and possesses a creative life, which I lack. But how can I possibly make? But how can I make my way to it? For as a grown man, it seemed impossible to me that I should be able to bridge the distance from the present back to my 11th year. Yet, if I wanted to re-establish contact with that period, I had no choice but to return to it and to take up that child's life with his childish games. This moment was a turning point in my fate, but I gave in only after endless resistance and with a certain resignation. For it was painfully humiliating experience to realize that there was nothing to be done except play childish games. Nevertheless, I began accumulating suitable stones, gathering them partly from the lake shore and partly from the water, and I started building. Cottages, a castle, a whole village. The church was still missing, so I made a square building with a hexagon drum on top of it and a dome. The church also requires an altar, but I hesitated to build that. preoccupied with the question of how I could approach this task. I was walking along the lake as usual one day, picking stones out of the gravel on the shore, and suddenly I caught sight of a red stone, a four-sided pyramid about an inch and a half high. It was a fragment of stone which had been polished into this shape by the action of the water, a pure product of chance. I knew at once this was an altar. I placed it in the middle under the dome, and as I did so I recalled the underground phallus of my childhood dream. This connection gave me a feeling of satisfaction. I went on with my building game after the noon meal every day, whenever the weather permitted. As soon as I was through eating, I began playing and continued to do so until the patients arrived. And if I finished with my work early enough in the evening, I went back to building. In the course of this activity, my thoughts clarified, and I was able to grasp the fantasies whose presence in my mind I dimly felt. Naturally, I thought about the significance of what I was doing, and I asked myself, now really, what are you about? You are building a small town and doing it as if it were a right. I had no answer to my question, only the inner certainty that I was on the way to discovering my own myth. For the building game was only beginning. It released a stream of fantasies which I later carefully wrote down. This sort of thing has been consistent with me, and at any time in my life, when I came up against a blank wall, I painted a picture or hewed stone. Each time, each such experience proved to be a rite d'entrée for the ideas and the work that followed hard upon it. Everything that I have written this year, and the footnote is 1957, and last year, The Undiscovered Self, Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth, a Psychological View of Conscious, has grown out of the stone sculptures I did after my wife's death. Footnote, November 27, 1955. The close of her life, the end, and what it made me realize, wrenched me violently out of myself. It cost me a great deal to regain my footing, and contact with stone helped me. Towards the autumn of 1913, the pressure which I had felt was in me seemed to be moving outward, as though there were something in the air. The atmosphere actually seemed to me darker than it had been. It was as though the sense of oppression no longer sprang exclusively from the psychic situation, but from concrete reality. This feeling grew more and more intense. In October, when I was alone on a journey, I was suddenly seized by an overpowering vision. I saw a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North and Sea and the Alps. When it came to Switzerland, I saw that the mountains grew higher and higher to protect our country. I realized that a frightful catastrophe was in progress. I saw the mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, and the drowning bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the whole sea turned to blood. The vision lasted for about 1 hour. I was perplexed and nauseated and ashamed of my weakness. 2 weeks passed, and then the vision reoccurred, under the same conditions, even more vividly than before, and the blood was more emphasized. An inner voice spoke, "Look at it well. It is wholly real, and it will be so. You cannot doubt it." That winter, somebody asked me what I thought were the political prospects of the world in the near future. I replied that I had no thoughts on the matter, but that I saw rivers of blood. I asked myself whether these visions pointed to a revolution, but could not really imagine anything of the sort, and so I drew the conclusion that they had to do with me myself, and decided that I was menaced by a psychosis. The idea of war did not occur to me at all. Soon afterwards, in the spring and early summer of 1914, I had a thrice-repeated dream that in the middle of summer an Arctic cold wave descended and froze the land to ice. I saw, for example, the whole of Lorraine and its canals frozen, and the entire region totally deserted by human beings. All living green things were killed by frost. This dream came in April and May, and for the last time in June 1914. In the third dream, frightful cold had again descended from out of the cosmos. This dream, however, had an unexpected end. There stood a leaf-bearing tree, but without fruit, my tree of life, I thought, whose leaves had been transformed by the effects of the frost into sweet grapes full of healing juices. I plucked the grapes and gave them to a large waiting crowd. By the end of June 1914, I was invited by the British Medical Association to deliver a lecture, quote, on the importance of the unconscious in psychopathology, unquote, at a congress in Aberdeen. I was prepared for something to happen, for such visions and dreams were fateful. In my state of mind just then, with the fears that were pursuing me, it seemed fateful to me that I should have to talk on the importance of the unconscious at such a time. On August 1st, the World War broke out. Now my task was clear. I had to try to understand what had happened and to what extent my own experience coincided with that of mankind in general. Therefore, my first obligation was to probe the depths of my own psyche. I had made I made a beginning by writing down the fantasies which had come to me during my building game. This work took precedence over everything else. An incessant stream of fantasies had been released, and I did my best not to lose my head but to find some way to understand these strange things. I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible. I was living in a constant state of tension. Often I felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me. One thunderstorm followed another. My enduring these storms was a question of brute strength. Others have been shattered by them, Nietzsche and Hölderlin and many others. But there was a demonic strength in me, and from the beginning there was no doubt in my mind that I must find the meaning of what I was experiencing in these fantasies. When I endured these assaults of the unconscious, I had an unswerving conviction that I was obeying a higher will, and that feeling continued to uphold me until I had mastered that feeling continued to uphold me until I had mastered the task. I was frequently so wrought up that I had to do certain yoga exercises in order to hold my emotions in check. But since it was my purpose to know what was going on within myself, I would do these exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to resume my work with the unconscious. And as soon as I had the feeling that I was myself again, I abandoned the restraint upon the emotions and allowed the images and inner voices to speak afresh. The Indian, on the other hand, does yoga exercises in order to obliterate completely the multitude of psychic contents and images. To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calm and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. This is a chance that I might have succeeded in splitting them off. There is a chance that I might have succeeded in splitting them off, but in that case I would inexorably have fallen into a neurosis and so been ultimately destroyed by them anyhow. As a result of my experiment, I learned how helpful it can be, from the therapeutic point of view, to find the particular images which lie behind emotions. I wrote down the fantasies as well as I could, and made an earnest effort to analyze the psychic conditions under which they had risen. But I was able to do this only in clumsy language. First I formulated the things as I observed them, usually in high-flown language, for that corresponded to the style of the archetypes. Archetypes speak the language of high rhetoric, even on bombast. It is a style I find embarrassing. It grates on my nerves, and when somebody draws his nails down a plaster wall, or scrapes his knife against a plate. But since I did not know what was going on, I had no choice but to write down everything in the style selected by the unconscious itself. Sometimes it was as if I were hearing it with my own ears, sometimes I was feeling it with my own mouth, and if my tongue were formulating words. But now and then I heard myself whispering aloud. Below the threshold of consciousness, everything was seething with life. From the beginning, I had convinced my involuntary confrontation with the unconscious. I had convinced my voluntary confrontation with the unconscious as a scientific experiment, which I myself was conducting, and whose outcome I was vitally interested. Today, I might equally well say that it was an experiment which was being conducted on me. One of the greatest difficulties for me lay in dwelling with my negative feelings. I was voluntarily submitting myself to emotions of which I could not really approve, and I was writing down fantasies which often struck me as nonsense, and towards which I had strong resistances. For as long as we do not understand their meaning, such fantasies are a diabolical mixture of the sublime and the ridiculous. It cost me a great deal to undergo them, but I had been challenged by fate. Only by extreme effort was I finally able to escape in from the labyrinth. In order to grasp the fantasies which were stirring in me underground, I knew I had to let myself plummet down to them, as it were. I felt not only violent resistance to this, but a distant fear. For I was afraid of losing command of myself and becoming a prey to the fantasies, and, as a psychiatrist, I realized only too well what that meant. After prolonged hesitation, however, I saw that there was no other way out. I had to take the chance and had to gain power over them, had to try to gain power over them, for I realized that if I did not do so, I ran the risk of their gaining power over me. A cogent motive for my making the attempt was the conviction that I could not expect of my patients something I did not dare to do myself. The excuse that a helper stood at their side and would not pass muster. The excuse was the excuse that a helper stood at their side would not pass muster, for I was well aware that the so-called helper, that is myself, could not help them unless he knew their fantasy material from his own direct experience, and that at present all he possessed were a few theoretical prejudices of dubious value. This idea that I was committing myself to a dangerous enterprise, not for myself alone, but also for the sake of my patients, helped me over several critical phases. It was during Advent of the year 1913, December 12th, to be exact, that I resolved upon the decisive step. I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Suddenly it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into the dark depths. I could not fend off a feeling of panic, but then abruptly, at not too great a depth, I landed on my feet in a soft, sticky mass. I felt great relief, although I was apparently in complete darkness. After a while my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, which was rather like a deep twilight. Before me was the entrance to a dark cave, in which stood a dwarf with a leathery skin, as if he were mummified. I squeezed past him through the narrow entrance, and waded knee-deep through the icy water to the other end of the cave, where, on a projecting rock, I saw a glowing red crystal. I grasped the stone, lifted it, and discovered a hollow underneath. At first I could make out nothing, but then I saw that there was running water. In it a corpse floated by, and a youth with blond hair and a wound in the head. He was followed by a gigantic black scarab, and then by a red newborn sun rising out of the depths of the water. Dazzled by the light, I wanted to replace the stone upon the opening, but then a fluid welled out. It was blood. A thick jet of it leapt up, and I felt nauseated. It seemed to me that the blood continued to spurt for an unendurably long time. At last it ceased, and the vision came to an end. I was stunned by this vision. I realized, of course, that it was a hero and solar myth, a drama of death and renewal. The rebirth was symbolized by the Egyptian scarab. At the end, the dawn of the new day should have followed, but instead came the intolerable outpouring of blood, an altogether abnormal phenomenon, so it seemed to me. But then I recalled the vision of blood that I had had in the autumn of the same year, and I abandoned all further attempt to understand. 6 days later, December 18, 1913, I had the following dream. I was with an unknown brown-skinned man, a savage, in a lone rocky mountain landscape. It was before dawn. The eastern sky was already bright and the stars fading. Then I heard Siegfried's horn sounding over the mountains, and I knew we had to kill him. We were armed with rifles and lay in wait for him on a narrow path over the rocks. Then Siegfried appeared high on the crest of the mountains, in the first ray of the rising sun. On a chariot made out of the bones of the dead, he drove at furious speed down the precipitous slope. When he turned a corner, we shot at him, and he plunged down, struck dead. Filled with disgust and remorse for having destroyed something so great and beautiful, I turned to flee, impelled by the fear that the murder might be discovered. But a tremendous downfall of rain began, and I knew that it would wipe out all traces of the dead. I had escaped the danger of discovery. Life could go on, but an unbearable feeling of guilt remained. When I awoke from the dream, I turned it over in my mind, but was unable to understand it. I tried, therefore, to fall asleep again, but a voice within me said, "You must understand the dream, and must do so at once." The inner urgency mounted until the terrible moment came when the voice said, "If you do not understand the dream, you must shoot yourself." In the drawer of my night table lay a loaded revolver, and I became frightened. Then I began pondering it once again, and suddenly the meaning of the dream dawned on me. Why, this is the problem that is being played out in the world. Siegfried, I thought, represents what the Germans want to achieve, heroically to impose their will and have their own way. Where there is a will, there is a way. I wanted to do the same, but now that was no longer possible. The dream showed that the attitude embodied by Siegfried, the hero, no longer suited me. Therefore, it had to be killed. After the deed, I felt an overpowering compassion, as though I myself had been shot, a sign of my secret identity with Siegfried, as well as the grief a man feels when he is forced to sacrifice his ideal and his conscious attitudes. This identity and my heroic idealism had to be abandoned, for there are higher things than the ego's will, and to these one must bow. These thoughts sufficed for the present, and I fell asleep again. The small, brown-skinned savage who accompanied me and had actually taken the initiative in the killing was an embodiment of the primitive shadow. The rain showed that the tension between the conscious and the unconscious was being resolved. Although at the time I was not able to understand the meaning of the dream beyond these few hints, new forces were released in me which helped me to carry the experiment with the unconscious to a conclusion. In order to seize hold of the fantasies, I frequently imagined a steep descent. I even made several attempts to get to the very bottom. The first time I reached, as it were, a depth of about 1,000 feet. The next time I found myself at the edge of a cosmic abyss. It was like a voyage to the moon or a descent into empty space. First came the image of a crater, and I had the feeling that I was in the land of the dead. The atmosphere was that of the other world. Now the steep slope of the rock I caught sight Now, near the steep slope of the rock, I caught sight of two figures, an old man with a white beard and a beautiful young girl. I summoned up my courage and approached them as though they were real people, and listened attentively to what they told me. The old man explained that he was Elijah, and that gave me a shock. But the girl staggered me even more, for she called herself Salome. She was blind. What a strange couple, Salome and Elijah! But Elijah assured me that he and Salome had belonged together for all eternity, which completely astonished me. They had a black serpent living with them, which displayed an unmistakable fondness for me. I stuck close to Elijah because he seemed to be the most reasonable of the three, and to have a clear intelligence. Of Salome, I was distinctly suspicious. Elijah and I had a long conversation, which, however, I did not understand. Naturally, I tried to find a plausible explanation for the appearance of a biblical figure in my fantasy by reminding myself that my father had been a clergyman. But that really explained myself in a bottomless abyss of ignorance. My ego felt devalued, although the successes I had been having in worldly affairs might have reassured me. In my darkness, horridas nostrae mentis purga tenebris, or cleanse the horrible darkness of our mind, the Aurora Consurgens says, footnote, in a chemical treatise ascribed to Thomas Aquinas, end footnote. I could have wished for nothing better than a real, live guru, someone possessing superior knowledge and ability who would have disentangled for me the involuntary creations of my imagination. But this task was undertaken by the figure of Philemon, whom, in this respect, I had willy-nilly to recognize as my psychagogue. And the fact that he was conveyed to me many an illuminating idea. More than 15 years later, a highly cultivated elderly Indian visited me, a friend of Gandhi's, and we talked about Indian education, in particular about the relationship between Guru and Shila. I hesitantly asked him whether he could tell me anything about the person and character of his own gurus, whereupon he replied in a matter-of-fact tone, "Oh yes, he was Shankaracharya." "You don't mean the commentator on the Vedas who died centuries ago?" I asked. "Yes, I mean him," he said to my amazement. Then you were referring to a spirit? I asked. Of course it was a spirit, he agreed. At that moment, I thought of Philemon. There are ghostly gurus too, he said. Most people have living gurus, but there are always some who have a spirit for a teacher. This information was both illuminating and reassuring to me. Evidently, then, I had not plummeted right out of the human world, but had only experienced the sort of thing that could happen to others who made similar efforts. Later, Philemon became revitalized by the emergence of yet another figure, whom I call Ka. In ancient Egypt, the king's Ka was his earthly form and the embodied soul. In my fantasy, the Ka soul came from below, out of the earth, as if out of the deep shaft. I did a painting of him, showing him in the earth-bound form as a herm with base of stone and upper part of bronze. High up in the painting appears a kingfisher's wing, and between it and the head of Ka floating a round, glowing nebula of stars. Ka's expression has something demonic about it, one might also say Mephistophelian. In one hand he holds something like a colored pagoda, or a reliquary, and in the other a stylus with which he is working on the reliquary. He is saying, "I am he who buries the gods in gold and gems." Philemon had a lame foot, but a winged spirit, whereas Ka represents a kind of earth demon or metal demon. Philemon was the spirited aspect or meaning. Ka, on the other hand, was the spirit of nature, like the anthroparion of Greek alchemy, with which at the time I was still unfamiliar. Footnote: the anthroparion is a tiny man, a kind of homunculus. He is found, for example, in the visions of Zosimos of Panopolis, an important alchemist of the 3rd century. To the group which includes the anthroparion belongs the gnomes, the dactyls of classical antiquity, and the homunculi of the alchemists. As a spirit of quicksilver, the alchemical Mercurius was also an anthroparion. A.J. End of footnote. Ka was he who made everything real, but who also obscured the halcyon spirit, meaning, or replaced it by beauty, the eternal reflection. In time I was able to integrate both figures through the study of alchemy. When I was writing down these fantasies, I once asked myself, what am I really doing? Certainly this has nothing to do with science, but then what is it? Whereupon a voice within me said, it is art. I was astonished. It had never entered my head that what I was writing had any connection with art. Then I thought perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that is not me, and which is insisting on coming through an expression. I knew for a certainty that the voice had come up from a woman. I recognized it as the voice of a patient, a talented psychopath who had a strong transference to me. She had become a living figure within my mind. Obviously, what I was doing wasn't science. What then could it be but art? It was as though these were the only alternatives in the world, and this is the way a woman's mind works. I said very empathetically to this voice that my fantasies had nothing to do with art, and I felt a great inner resistance. No voice came through, however, and I kept on writing. Then came the next assault, and against the next same assertion, this is art. This time I caught her and said, no, this is not art. On the contrary, it is nature, and prepared myself for an argument. When nothing of the sort occurred, I reflected that the woman within me did not have the speech centers I had, and so I suggested that she use mine. She did so, and came through with a long statement. I was greatly intrigued by the fact that a woman should interfere with me from within. My conclusion was that she must be the soul in the primitive sense, and I began to speculate on the reason why the name Anima was given to the soul. Why was it thought to be of as feminine? Later I came to see that this inner feminine figure plays a typical or archetypal role in the unconscious of a man, and I call her the anima. The corresponding figure in the unconscious of a woman I call the animus. At first it was the negative aspect of the anima that most impressed me. I felt a little awed by her. It was like the feeling of an invisible presence in the room. Then a new idea came to me, and putting down all the material for analysis, I was in effect writing letters to the Anima, that is, to a part of myself with a different viewpoint from my conscious one. I got remarks of an unusual and an unexpected character. I was like a patient in an analysis with a ghost and a woman. Every evening I wrote very conscientiously, for I thought if I did not write, there would be no way for the Anima to get my fantasies. Also, by writing them out, I gave her no chance to twist them into intrigues. There's a tremendous difference between intending to tell something and actually telling it. In order to be as honest as possible with myself, I wrote everything down very carefully, following the old Greek maxim, "Give away all that thou hast, and then thou shalt receive." Once, as I was writing, I would have peculiar reactions that threw me off. Slowly I learned to distinguish between myself and the interruptions. When something emotionally vulgar or banal came up, I would say to myself, "It is perfectly true that I have thought and felt this way at some point or another, but I don't have to think and feel that way any more. I need not accept this banality of mine in perpetuity. It is an unnecessary humiliation." The essential thing is to differentiate oneself from these unconscious contents by personifying them, and at the same time to bring them into relationship with consciousness. That is the technique for stripping them of their powers. It is not too difficult to personify them, as they always possess a certain degree of autonomy, a separate identity of their own. Their autonomy is a most uncomfortable thing to reconcile oneself to, and yet the very fact that the unconscious presents itself in this way gives us the best means of handling it. What the Anima said seemed to me full of deep cunning. If I had taken these fantasies of the unconscious as art, they would have carried no more conviction than visual perceptions, as if I were watching a movie. I might have felt no moral obligation towards them. The Anima might then have easily seduced me into believing that I was a misunderstood artist, and that my so-called artistic nature gave me the right to neglect reality. If I had followed her voice, she would, in all probability, have said to me one day, "Do you imagine the nonsense you're engaged in is really art? Not a bit." Thus the insinuations of the Anima, the mouthpiece of the unconscious, can utterly destroy a man. In the final analysis, the decisive factor is always consciousness, which can understand the manifestations of the unconscious and take up a position towards them. But the Anima has a positive aspect as well. It is she who communicates the image of the unconscious to the conscious mind, and that is what I chiefly value her for. For decades I always turned to the Anima when I felt that my emotional behavior was disturbed and that something had been constellated in the unconscious. I would then ask the Anima, "Now what are you up to? What do you see? I should like to know," and after some resistance she regularly produced an image. As soon as the image was there, the unrest or the sense of oppression vanished. The whole energy of these emotions was transformed into interest in and curiosity about the image. I would speak with the Anima about the images she communicated to me, for I had to try to understand them as best I could, just like a dream. Today I no longer need these conversations with the Anima, for I no longer have such emotions. But if I did have them, I would deal with them in the same way. Today I am directly conscious of the Anima's ideas because I have learned to accept the contents of the unconscious and to understand them. I know how I must behave towards the inner images. I can read their meaning directly from my dreams, and therefore no longer need a mediator to communicate them. I wrote these fantasies down in the black book. Later I transferred them to the red book, which I also embellished with drawings. Footnote: the black book consists of 6 black-bound smallish leather notebooks. The red book, a folio volume bound in red leather, contains the same fantasies couched in elaborately literary forms and language and set down in calligraphic Gothic script in the manner of medieval manuscripts. A.J. End of footnote. It contains most of my mandala drawings. In the red book I tried an aesthetic elaboration of my fantasies, but never finished it. I became aware that if I had not yet found the right language, that I still had to translate it into something else. Therefore I gave up the aestheticizing tendency in a good time in favor of rigorous process of understanding. I saw that so much fantasy needed firm ground underfoot, and that I must first return wholly to reality. For me, reality meant scientific comprehension. I had to draw concrete conclusions from the insights the unconscious had given me, and that task was to become a life work. It is, of course, ironical that I, a psychiatrist, should, at almost every step of my experiment, have run into the same psychic material, which is the stuff of psychosis and is found in the insane. This is the fund of unconscious images which fatally confuse the mental patient, but it is also the matrix of the mythopoetic imagination which has vanished from our rational age, or our rational age. Through such imagination, Though such imagination is present everywhere, it is both tabooed and dreaded, so that it even appears to be a risky experiment or a questionable adventure to entrust oneself with the uncertain path that leads into the depths of the unconscious. It is considered the path of error, of equivocation, and misunderstanding. I am reminded of Goethe's words, quote, "Now let me dare to open wide the gates, past which men's steps ever have flinching trod." End of footnote. Faust Part 1. The second part of Faust 2 was more than a literary exercise. It is a link to the Aurea Cantina, footnote, the golden or Homeric chain in alchemy in the series of the great wise men, beginning with Hermes' Tres Megistos, which links earth with heaven, e.j. End of footnote. So it is the link to the Aurea Cantina, which has existed from the beginnings of philosophical alchemy and Gnosticism down to Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Unpopular, ambiguous, and dangerous, it is a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Particularly at this time, when I was working on the fantasies, I needed a point of support in this world, and I may say that my family and my professional work were that to me. It was most essential for me to have a normal life in the real world as a counterpoise to the strange inner world. My family and my profession remained the base to which I could always return, assuring me that I was an actually existing ordinary person. The unconscious contents could have driven me out of my wits, but my family and the knowledge. I have a medical diploma from a Swiss university. I must help my patients. I have a wife and 5 children. I live at 228 Seestrasse in Kuschnach. These were actualities which made demands upon me and proved to me again and again that I really existed, that I was not a blank page whirling about in the winds of the spirit like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had lost the ground under his feet because he possessed nothing more than the inner world of his thoughts, which incidentally possessed him more than he it. He was uprooted and hovered above the earth, and therefore he succumbed to exaggeration and irreality. For me, such irreality was the quintessence of horror, for I aimed, after all, at this world and this life. No matter how deeply absorbed or how blown about I was, I always knew that everything I was experiencing was ultimately directed in the real life of mine. I meant to meet its obligations and fulfill its meanings. My watchword was hic rodius hilc salta. Thus my family and my profession always remained a joyful reality and a guarantee that I also had a normal existence. Very gradually the outlines of the inner change began making their appearance within me. In 1916 I felt an urge to give shape to something I was compelled from within, and, as it were, to formulate and express what might have been said by Philemon. This was how Septem Sermona ad Mortus, with its particular language, came into being. So, Septem Sermones ad Mortus is a privately printed and pseudonymously subtitled The 7 Sermons to the Dead, written by Bastylides in Alexandria, the city where the East touched the West. See Appendix 5. So let's see Appendix 5. Appendix 5, Septem Sermones ad Mortus, 1916. Young Aloud, Septem Sermones ad Mortus, 7 Sermons in the Dead, to be published privately as a booklet. He occasionally gave copies to friends. It was never obtained at bookstores. Later he described it as a sin of his youth and regretted it. The language is more or less in the style of the Red Book, but compared with the endless conversations with the inner figures in the Red Book, the 7 Sermons form a self-contained whole. They convey an impression, if only a fragmentary one, of what Young went through in the years 1913 to 1917, of which he was bringing to birth. The sermons contain hints or anticipations of ideas that were to figure later in his scientific writings, more particularly concerning the polaristic nature of the psyche, of life in general, of all the psychological statements. It was their thinking and paradoxes that drew Jung to the Gnostics. This is why he identifies himself here with the Gnostic writer Basilides, early 2nd century AD, and even takes over some of his terminology, for example, God as Abraxas. It was a deliberate game of mystification. Jung consecrated to the publication of the 7 sermons in his memoirs only hesitantly and only for the sake of honesty. He never disclosed the key to the algorithm at the end of the book. The 7 sermons to the dead, written by Basilides in Alexandria, the city where the east touches the west. Sermo 1. The dead came back from Jerusalem, where they found not what they sought. They prayed me, let them in, and besought my word, and thus I began my teaching. Hearken. I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as fullness. Its infinity, full, is no better than empty. Nothingness is both empty and full. As well might ye say anything else of nothingness, as for instance, white it is, or black, or again, it is not, or it is. A thing that is infinite and eternal hath no qualities, since it hath all qualities. This nothingness or fullness we name pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and infinite possess no qualities. In it no being is, for he then would be distinct from the pleroma, and would possess qualities which would distinguish him as something distinct from the pleroma. In the pleroma there is nothing and everything. It is quite fruitless to think about the pleroma, for this would mean self-dissolution. Creatura is not the pleroma, but in itself. The pleroma is both the beginning and end of created things. It pervadeth them as the light of the sun everywhere pervadeth the air. Although the pleroma pervadeth altogether, yet hath created being no share thereof, just as a wholly transparent body becometh neither light nor dark, through the light which pervadeth it. We are, however, the pleroma itself, for we are a part of the eternal and the infinite. But we have no share thereof, as we are from the pleroma infinitely removed, not spiritually or temporally, but essentially, since we are distinguished from the pleroma in our essence as creatura, which is confined within time and space. Yet, because we are parts of the pleroma is also in us. Even in the smallest point is the pleroma endless, eternal, and entire, since small and great are qualities which are contained in it. It is that nothingness which is everywhere whole and continuous. Only figuratively, therefore, do I speak of created being as a part of the pleroma, because actually the pleroma is nowhere divided, since it is nothingness. We are also the whole pleroma, because figuratively the pleroma is the smallest point, assuming only, not existing, in us, and the boundless firmament around us. But wherefore, then, do we speak of the pleroma at all, since it is thus everything and nothing? I speak of it, then, to make a beginning somewhere, and also to free you from the delusion that somewhere, either without or within, there standeth something fixed, or in some way established from the beginning. Every so-called fixed and certain thing is only relative. That alone is fixed and certain, which is subject to change. What is changeable, however, is creatura. Therefore, it is the one thing which is fixed and certain, because it hath qualities. It is even quality itself. The question ariseth, how did creatura originate? Created beings came to pass, not creatura. Since created beings is the very quality of the pleroma, as much as non-creation, which is the eternal death. In all times and places is creation, in all times and places is death. The pleroma hath all distinctiveness and non-distinctiveness. Distinctiveness is creatura, it is distinct. Distinctiveness is its essence, therefore it distinguisheth. Therefore man discriminateth because his nature is distinctiveness. Wherefore also he distinguisheth qualities of the pleroma which are not. He distinguisheth then of his own nature. Therefore must he speak of qualities of the pleroma which are not. What use, say ye, to speak of it, sayest thou not thyself, there is no profit in thinking upon this Pleroma. That said I unto you, to free you from the delusion that we are able to think about the Pleroma. When we distinguish qualities of the Pleroma, we are speaking from the ground of our own distinctiveness and concerning our own distinctiveness. But we have said nothing concerning the Pleroma. Concerning our own distinctiveness, however, it is needful to speak whereby we may distinguish ourselves enough. Our very nature is distinctiveness. If we are not true to this nature, we do not distinguish ourselves enough. Therefore must we make distinctions of qualities. What is the harm, ye ask, in not distinguishing one myself? If we do not distinguish, we get beyond our own nature, away from creature. We fall into indistinctiveness, which is the other quality of the Pleroma. We fall into the Pleroma itself and cease to be the creature. We are given over to delusion in the nothingness. That is the death of the creature. Therefore we die in such measure as we do not distinguish. Hence the natural striving of the creature goeth towards distinctiveness, fighting against primeval, perilous sameness. This is called the principum individuentis. This principle is the essence of the creature. From this you can see why indistinctiveness and non-distinction are a great danger for the creature. We must therefore distinguish the qualities of the Pleroma. The qualities are pairs of opposites, such as the effective and the ineffective, fullness and emptiness, living and dead, difference and sameness, light and darkness, the hot and the cold, force and matter, time and space, good and evil, beauty and ugliness, the one and the many, etc. The pair of opposites are qualities of the Pleroma which are not, because each balanceth each. As we are the Pleroma itself, we also have all the qualities in us. Because the very ground of our nature is distinctiveness, therefore we have the qualities in the name and sign of distinctiveness, which meaneth, 1. These qualities are distinct and separate in us one from the other, therefore they are not balanced and void, but are effective. Thus we are the victims of the pairs of opposites. The Pleroma is rent in us. 2. The qualities belong to the Pleroma, and only in the name and sign of distinctiveness can and must we possess or live them. We must distinguish ourselves from the qualities. In the Pleroma they are balanced and void, in us not. Being distinguished from them delivereth us. When we strive after the good or the beautiful, we thereby forget our own nature, which is distinctiveness, and we are delivered over to the qualities of the Pleroma, which are pairs of opposites. We labor to attain to the good and the beautiful, yet at the same time we also lay hold of the evil and the ugly, since in the Pleroma these are one with the good and the beautiful. When, however, we remain true to our own nature, which is distinctiveness, we distinguish ourselves from the good and the beautiful, and therefore at the same time from the evil and the ugly, and thus we fall not into the Pleroma, namely into nothingness and dissolution. Thou sayest, ye object, that difference and sameness are also qualities of the Pleroma. How would it be, then, if we strive after differentness? Are we, in doing so, not true to our own nature, and must we none the less be given over to sameness, when we strive after difference? You must not forget that the Pleroma hath no qualities. We create them through thinking. If, therefore, ye strive after difference or sameness or any qualities whatsoever, ye pursue thoughts which flow to you out of the Pleroma, thoughts, namely, concerning non-existing qualities of the Pleroma. Inasmuch as ye run after these thoughts, ye fall again into the Pleroma and reach difference and sameness at the same time. Not your thinking, but your being is distinctiveness. Therefore, not alter difference, as you think, must you strive, but after your own being. At bottom, therefore, there is only one striving, namely the striving after your own being. If ye had the striving, you would not need to know anything about the Pleroma and its qualities, and yet would ye come to your own right goal by virtue of your own being. Since, however, though estrangeth from being, that knowledge must I teach you, whereby ye may be able to hold your thoughts in leash. Sermo 2. In the night the dead stood along the wall and cried, We would have knowledge of God. Where is God? Is God dead? God is not dead. Now, as ever he liveth, God is creature, for he is something definite and therefore distinct from the pleroma. God is quality of the pleroma, and everything which I said of creatura is also true concerning him. He is distinguished, however, from created beings through this, that he is more indefinite and indeterminable than they. He is less distinct than creative beings, since the ground of his being is effective fullness. Only in so far as he is definite and distinct is he creature, and in like measure is he the manifestation of the effective fullness of pleroma. Everything which we do not distinguish falleth into the pleroma and is made void by its opposite. If therefore we do not distinguish God, effective fullness is for us extinguished. Moreover, God is the pleroma itself, as likewise each smallest point is the created and uncreated in the pleroma itself. Effective void is the nature of the devil. God and the devil are the first manifestations of nothingness, which we call the pleroma. It is indifferent whether the pleroma is or is not, since in everything it is balanced and void. Not so creatura. In so far as God and devil are creatura, they do not extinguish each other, but stand one against the other as effective opposites. We need no proof of their existence. It is enough that we must always be speaking of them. Even if both were not, creatura of its own essential distinctiveness would forever distinguish them anew out of the pleroma. Everything that discrimination taketh out of the pleroma is a pair of opposites. To God, therefore, always belongeth the devil. This inseparability is as close and as your own life hath made you see, and as indissoluble as the pleroma itself. Thus it is that both stand very close to the pleroma, in which all opposites are extinguished and joined. God and devil are distinguished by the qualities of fullness and emptiness, generation and destructive. Effectiveness is common to both. Effectiveness joineth them. Effectiveness, therefore, standeth above both. It is a God above God, since its effect is uniteth fullness and emptiness. This is the God whom ye know not, for mankind forgot it. We name it by its name Abraxas. It is more infinite still than God and the devil. That God may be distinguished from it, we name God Helios, or Sun. Abraxas is effect. Nothing standeth opposite to it but the ineffective. Hence its effective nature freely unfoldeth itself. The ineffective is not, therefore, resisteth not. Abraxas standeth above the sun and above the devil. It is improbable probability, unreal reality. Had the pleroma a being, Abraxas would be its manifestation. It is the effective itself, not any particular effect, but effect in general. It is unreal reality because it hath no definite effect. It is also creatura because it is distinct from the pleroma. The sun hath a definite effect, and so hath the devil. Wherefore do they appear to us more effective than indefinite Abraxas? It is force, duration, change. The dead now raised a great tumult, for they were Christians. Sermon 3. Like mists arising from the marsh, the dead came near and cried, Speak further unto us concerning the supreme God. Hard to know is the deity of Abraxas. Its power is the greatest because man perceiveth it not. From the sun he draweth the summanum bonum, from the devil the infimum malum, but from Abraxas life, altogether indefinite, the mother of good and evil. Smaller and weaker life seemeth to be than the summanum bonum. Wherefore it is also hard to conceive that Abraxas transcendeth even the sun in power, who is himself the radiant source of all the force of life. Abraxas is the sun, and at the same time the eternally sucking gorge of the void and the belittling and dismembering devil. The power of Abraxas is twofold, but ye see it not, because for your eyes our warring opposites of this power are extinguished. What the God's Son speaketh is life, what the devil speaketh is death, but Abraxas speaketh that hallowed and accursed word, which is life and death at the same time. Abraxas begetteth truth and lying, good and evil, light and darkness, in the same word and in the same act. Wherefore is Abraxas terrible. It is splendid as the lion in the instant he striketh down his victim. It is beautiful as the day of spring. It is great It is the great Pan himself, and also the small one. It is Priapos. It is the monster of the underworld, a thousand-armed polyp, coiled knot of winged serpent's frenzy. It is the hermaphrodite of the earliest beginning. It is the lord of the toads and the frogs which live in the water and go up on the land, where chorus ascendeth at noon and at midnight. It is abundance that seeketh union with emptiness. It is holy beginning. It is love and love's murder. It is the saint and his betrayer. It is the brightest light of day and the darkest night of the madness. To look upon it, it is blindness. To know it is sickness. To worship it is death. To fear it is wisdom. To resist it not is redemption. God dwelleth behind the sun, the devil behind the night. What God bringeth forth out of the light, the devil sucketh into the night. But Abraxas is the world, its becoming and its passing. Upon every gift that cometh from the God's Son, and the devil layeth his curse. Everything that ye entreat from the Son, God's Son, begetteth a deed of the devil. Everything ye create with the God's Son giveth effective power to the devil. That is terrible Abraxas. It is the mightiest creature, and in it the creature is afraid of itself. It is the manifest opposition of creature to the pleroma and its nothingness. It is the son's horror of the mother. It is the mother's love for the son. It is the delight of the earth and the cruelty of the heavens. Before its countenance man becomes like stone. Before it there is no question and no reply. It is the life of creature. It is the operation of distinctiveness. It is the love of man. It is the speech of man. It is the appearance of the shadow of man. It is illusory reality. Now the dead howled and raged, for they were unperfected. Sermo 4. The dead filled the place, murmuring, and said, Tell us of gods and devils, accursed one. The sun god is the highest god. The sun god is the highest good, the devil is the opposite. Thus ye have two gods. But there are many high and good things, and many great evils, and among these are the two god-devils. The one is the burning one, the other the growing one. The burning one is Eros, who hath the form of flame. Flame giveth light, because it consumeth. The growing one is the tree of life. It buddeth as it growed, as in growing it heapeth up living stuff. Eros flamed up and dieth, but the tree of life groweth with slow and constant increase through unmeasured time. Good and evil are united in the flame. Good and evil are united in the increase of the tree. In their divinity stand life and love opposed. Innumerable as the host of the stars is the number of gods and devils. Each star is a god, each space that a star filleth is a devil, but the empty fullness of the whole is the pleroma. The operation of the whole is Abraxas, to whom only the ineffective standeth opposed. 4 is the number of the principal gods, as 4 is the number of the world's measurements. 1 is the beginning, the god's son. 2 is for Eros, for he bindeth twain together, and outspreadeth himself in brightness. 3 is the tree of life, for it filleth space with bodily forms. 4 is the devil, for he openeth all that is closed. All that is formed of bodily nature doth he dissolve. He is the destroyer, in whom everything is brought to nothing. For me, to whom knowledge has been given of the multiplicity and diversity of the gods, it is well. But woe unto you who replace these incompatible many by a single God. For in doing so ye beget the torment which is bred not from understanding, and ye mutilate the creature whose nature and aim is distinctiveness. How can ye be true to your own nature when ye try to change the many into one? What ye do unto the gods is done likewise unto you. Ye all become equal, and thus is your nature maimed. Equality shall prevail not for God, but only for the sake of man. Even the gods are many, whilst men are few. The gods are mighty, and can endure their manifoldness. For like the stars they abide in solitude, parted one from the other by immense distance. But men are weak, and cannot endure the manifold nature. Therefore they dwell together, and need communion, that they may bear their separateness. For redemption's sake I teach you the rejected truth, for the sake of which I was rejected. The multiplicity of the gods correspondeth to the multiplicity of man. Numberless gods await the human state. Numberless gods have been men. Men shareth in the nature of the gods. He cometh from the gods and goeth unto God. Thus, just as it serveth not to reflect upon the Pleroma, it availeth not to worship the multiplicity of the gods. Least of all availeth it to worship the first God, the effective abundance, and the summa bonum. By our prayer we can add to it nothing, and from it nothing take, because the effectiveness void swalloweth all. The bright gods form the celestial world. It is manifold and infinitely spreading and increasing. The sun god is the supreme lord of that world. The dark gods form the earth world. They are simple and infinitely diminishing and declining. The devil is the earth world's lowest lord, the moon spirit satellite of the earth, smaller, colder, and more dead than the earth. There is no difference between the might of the celestial gods and those of the earth. The celestial gods magnify, the earth gods diminish. Measureless is the movement of both. Ceremony 5. The dead mocked and cried, "Teach us, fool of the Church and Holy Communion." The world of the gods is made manifest in spirituality and in sexuality. The celestial ones appear in spirituality, the earthly ones in sexuality. Spirituality conceiveth and embraceth. It is womanlike, and therefore we call it mater coelistis, the celestial mother. Sexuality engendereth and createth. It is manlike, and therefore we call it phallos, the earthy father. The sexuality of man is more of the earth. The sexuality of woman is more of the spirit. The spirituality of man is more of the heaven. It goeth to the greater. The spirituality of woman is more of the earth. It goeth to the smaller. Lying and devilish is the spirituality of man, which goeth to the smaller. Lying and devilish is the spirituality of woman, which goeth to the greater. Each which goeth to its own place. Man and woman become devils to one another when they divide not their spiritual ways, for the nature of creature is distinctiveness. The sexuality of man hath an earthward course, the sexuality of woman is spiritual. Man and woman become devils one to the other, if they distinguish not their sexuality. Man shall know of the smaller, woman the greater. Man shall distinguish himself both from spirituality and from sexuality. He shall call spirituality mother, and set her between heaven and earth. He shall call sexuality Phallus, and set him between earth and himself. For the mother and the Phallus are superhuman demons which reveal the world of the gods. They are for us more effective than the gods, because they are closely akin to our own nature. Should ye not distinguish yourself from sexuality and from spirituality, and not regard them as of a nature both above you and beyond, then ye are delivered over to them as qualities of the Pleroma. Spirituality and sexuality are not your qualities, not things which ye possess and contain, but they possess and contain you, for they are powerful demons, manifestations of the gods, and are, therefore, things which reach beyond you, existing in themselves. So no man hath a spirituality unto himself, or a sexuality unto himself, but he standeth under the law of spirituality and of sexuality. No man therefore escapeth these demons. You shall look upon them as demons, and as a common task and danger, a common burden which life hath laid upon you. Thus is life for you also a common task and danger, as are the gods, and first of all, terrible Abraxas. Man is weak, therefore in communion indispensable. If your communion be not under the sign of the mother, then it is under the sign of the Phallos. No communion is suffering and sickness. Communion is everything in dismemberment and dissolution. Distinctiveness leadeth to singleness. Singleness is opposed to communion, because of man's weakness over against the gods and demons. Their invincible law is communion needful. Therefore shall there be as much communion as is needful, not for man's sake, but because of the gods. The gods force you to communion. As much as they force you, so much is communion needed. More is evil. In communion, let every man submit to others, that communion be maintained, for ye need it. In singleness, the one man shall be superior to the others, that every man may come to himself and avoid slavery. In communion, there shall be continence. In singleness, there shall be prodigy. In communion is depth, singleness is height. Right measure in communion purifieth and preserveth. Right measure in singleness purifieth and increaseth. Communion giveth us warmth, singleness giveth us light. Sermon 6. The diamond of sexuality approacheth our soul as a serpent. It is half human, and appeareth as thought desire. The diamond of spirituality descendeth into our soul as the whole bird. It is half human, and appeareth as desire thought. The serpent is an earthly soul, half daimonic, a spirit akin to the spirits of the dead. Thus too, like these, she swarmeth around in the things of earth, making us either to fear them or pricking us with intemperate desire. The serpent hath a nature unlike like a woman. She seeketh ever the company of the dead, who are held by the spell of the earth, they who found not the way beyond that leadeth to singleness. The serpent is a whore. She wandereth with the devil and the evil spirits. A mischievous tyrant and a tormentor, ever seducing the evilest to evilest company. The white bird is a half celestial soul of man. He biddeth with the mother from time to time descending. The bird hath a nature like unto man, and is effective thought. He is chaste and solitary, a messenger of the mother. He flieth high above the earth. He commandeth singleness. He bringeth knowledge from the distant ones who went before and are perfected. He beareth our word above to the mother. She intercedeth, she warneth, but against the gods she had no power. She is a vessel of the sun. The serpent goeth below her with her cunning. She lament the phallic demon, or else goadeth unto him, or him on. She yielded up the two crafty thoughts of the earthly one, those thoughts which creep through every hole, and cleave to all things with desirousness. The serpent, doubtless, whilst it not, yet she must be of use to us. She fleeth our grasp, thus showing us to the way which our human wits we could not find. With disdainful glance the dead spake. Cease this talk of gods and demons and souls. At bottom this hath long been known to us. Sermon 7. Yet when night had come, the dead again approached the lamentable mine and said, There is yet one matter we forgot to mention. Teach us about man. Man is a gateway through which from outer worlds of gods, demons, and souls ye pass into the inner world, out of the greater and into the smaller world. Small and transitory is man. Already is he behind you, and once again you find yourselves in endless space, the smaller and innermost infinity. An immeasurable distance standeth one single star in the zenith. This is the one God of this one man. This is his world, his pleroma, his divinity. In this world is man Abraxas, the creator and the destroyer of his own world. This star is the God and the goal of man. This is his one guiding God. In him goeth man to his rest. Toward him goeth the long journey of the soul after death. In him shineth forth as all light all that man bringeth back from the greater world. To this one God man shall pray. Prayer increaseth the light of the star. It casteth a bridge over death. It prepareth life for the smaller world, and assuageth the hopeless desire of the greater. When the greater world waxes cold, burneth the star. Between man and his one God there standeth nothing, so long as man can turn away his eyes from the flaming spectacle of Abraxas. Man here, God there, weakness and nothingness here, but eternally creative power. Here nothing but darkness and chilling moisture, there holy sun. Whereupon the dead were silent, and ascended like the smoke above the herdman's fire, who through the night kept watch over his flock. Anagramma, and then it has some anagrams, which I will spell out. Nahtriheccunde is one. GAHINNEVERRAHTUNIN is another one, and ZEHGESSURKLACH is the third, and the last is ZUNNUS, and this was all translated by H.G. Baines. So now we return to the reading of Confrontation with the Unconscious, and I will restart with the very end of the last paragraph, where we directed ourselves to Appendix 5. So, I was compelled from within, as it were, to formulate and express what might have been said by the Philemon. This was how the Septem Sermones ad Mortuos, the seven sermons to the dead, with its particular language came into being. So then we read all of those, so now we begin. It began with a restlessness, but I did not know what it meant or what they wanted of me. There was an ominous atmosphere all around me. I had the strange feeling that the air was filled with ghostly entities. Then it was as if my house began to be haunted. My eldest daughter saw a white figure passing through the room. My second daughter, independently of her elder sister, related that twice in the night her blanket had been snatched away, and that same night my 9-year-old son had an anxiety dream. In the morning I asked his mother for crayons, and he, who ordinarily never drew, now made a picture of his dream. He called it the picture of the fisherman. Through the middle of the picture ran a river, and a fisherman with a rod was standing on the shore. He had caught a fish. On the fisherman's head was a chimney, from which flames were leaping and smoke rising. From the other side of the river the devil came flying through the air. He was cursing because his fish had been stolen. But above the fisherman hovered an angel who said, "You cannot do anything to him. He only catches the bad fish." My son drew this picture, on a Saturday. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, the front door began ringing frantically. It was a bright summer day. The two maids were in the kitchen, from which the open square outside the front door could be seen. Everyone immediately looked to see who was there, and there was no one in sight. I was sitting near the doorbell, and had not only heard it, but saw it moving. We all simply stared at one another. The atmosphere was thick, believe me. And then I knew that something had to be done. The whole house was filled, as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deeply right up to the door, and the air was so thick that it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all a-quiver with the question, "For God's sake, what in the world is this?" Then they cried out in chorus, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we sought." This was the beginning of the Septem Sermones. Then it began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings the thing was written. As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghastly assemblage evaporated. The room quieted, and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over. The experience had to be taken for what it was, or as it seems to have been. No doubt it was connected with a state of emotion I was in at the time, which was favorable to parapsychological phenomena. It was an unconscious constellation whose particular atmosphere I recognized as the Newman of the archetype. It walks abroad. It's in the air. Footnote. Faust, Part 2, end footnote. The intellect, of course, would like to arrogate to itself some scientific physical knowledge of the affair, or preferably to write the whole thing off as a violation of the rules. But what a dreary world it would be if the rules were not violated sometimes. Shortly before this experience I had written down a fantasy of my soul having flown away from me. This was a significant event. The soul, the anima, establishes the relationship to the unconscious. It is, in a certain sense, there is also a relationship to the collectivity of the dead, for the unconscious corresponds to the mythic land of the dead and the land of the ancestors. If therefore one had a fantasy of the soul vanishing, this means that it was a withdrawal from the unconscious, or into the land of the dead. There it produces a mysterious animation and gives visible form to the ancestral trances, the collective contents. Like a medium, it gives the dead a chance to manifest themselves. Therefore, soon after the disappearance of my soul, the dead appeared to me, and the result was the Septem Sermones. This is an example of what is called loss of soul, a phenomenon encountered quite frequently among primitives. From that time on, the dead have become ever more distinct for me as the voices of the unanswered, unresolved, and unredeemed. For since the questions and demands which my destiny required me to answer did not come to me from outside, they must have come from the inner world. These conversations with the dead formed a kind of prelude to which I had to communicate to the world about the unconscious, a kind of pattern of order and interpretation of its general contents. When I look back upon it all today and considered what happened to me during the period of my work on the fantasies, it seems as though a message had come to me with overwhelming force. There were things in the images which concerned not only myself but many others also. It was then that I ceased to belong to myself alone, ceased to have the right to do so. From then on, my life belonged to the generality. The knowledge I was concerned with, or was seeking, still could not be found in the science in those days. I myself had to undergo the original experience, and moreover to try to plant the results of my experience in the soil of reality. Otherwise they would have remained subjective assumptions without validity. It was then that I dedicated myself to the service of the psyche. I loved it and hated it, but it was my greatest wealth. My delivering myself over to, as it were, was the only way which I could endure my existence and live it as fully as possible. Today I can say that I have never lost touch with my initial experiences. All my works, all my creative activity has come from those initial fantasies and dreams which began in 1912, almost 50 years ago. Everything that I accomplished in later life was already contained in them, although at first only in the form of emotions and images. My science was the only way I had of extricating myself from that chaos. Otherwise the material would have entrapped in me in its thicket, strangled me like jungle creepers. I took great care to try to understand every single image, every item of my psychic inventory, and to classify them scientifically as far as this was possible, and above all, to realize them in actual life. That is what we usually neglect to do. We allow the images to rise up, and maybe we wonder about them, but that's all. We do not take the trouble to understand them, let alone draw ethical conclusions from them. This stopping short conjures up negative effects of the unconscious. It is equally a grave mistake to think that it is enough to gain some understanding of the images, and that knowledge can here make a halt. Insight into them must be converted into an ethical obligation. Not to do so is to fall prey to the power principle, and this produces dangerous effects, which are destructive not only to others but even to the knower. The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a person. Failure to understand them or shirking of ethical responsibility deprives the person of their wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness on their life. In the midst of this period, I was so preoccupied with the images of unconscious, I came to the decision to withdraw from the university, where I had lectured for 8 years in Privatdozent since 1905. My experience and experiments with the unconscious had brought my intellectual activity to a standstill. After the completion of the psychology of the unconscious, I found myself utterly incapable of reading a scientific book. This went on for 3 years. I felt I could no longer keep up with the world of the intellect, nor would I have been able to talk about what really preoccupied me. The material brought to light from the unconscious had almost literally struck me dumb. Footnote. During this fallow period, Young wrote very little, a handful of papers in English, and the very important first versions of the essay published in English translated as 2 essays on analytical psychology. The period came to an end with the publication of Psychological Types in 1921. End of footnote. I could neither understand nor give it form. At the university I was in an exposed position and felt that in order to go on giving courses there I would first have to find an entirely new and different orientation. It would be unfair to continue teaching younger students when my own intellectual situation was nothing but a mass of doubts. I therefore felt that I was confronted with the choice of either continuing my academic career, whose roads lay smooth before me, or following the laws of my inner personality, of a higher reason, and forging ahead with this curious task of mine, this experiment in confrontation with the unconscious. But, until it was completed, I could not appear before the public. Consciously, deliberately, then, I abandoned my academic career, for I felt that something great was happening to me, and I put my trust in the thing which I had felt to be more important sub specie aeternitas. I knew that it would fill my life, and for the sake of that goal, I was ready to take any kind of risk. What, after all, did it matter whether or not I became a professor? Of course it bothered me to have to give this up. In many respects I regretted that I could not continue my generally understandable material. I had even moments when I stormed against destiny, but emotions of this kind are transitory and do not count. The other thing, on the contrary, is important, and if we pay heed to what the inner personality desires and says, the sting vanishes. That is something I have experienced again and again, not only when I gave up my academic career. Indeed, I had my first experiences of this sort as a child. In my youth I was hot-tempered, but whenever the emotion had reached its climax, suddenly it swung around and there followed a cosmic stillness. At such times I was remote from everything, and what had only a moment before excited me seemed to belong to a distant past. The consequence of my resolve and my involvement with things which neither I nor any one else could understand was an extreme loneliness. I was going about and laden with thoughts of which I could speak to no one. They would only have been misunderstood. I felt the gulf between the eternal world and the interior world of images in its most painful form. I could not yet see that interaction of both worlds which I now understand. I saw only an irreconcilable contradiction between inner and outer. However, it was clear to me from the start that I could find contact with the outer world and with people only if I succeeded in showing, and this would demand the most intensive effort, that the contents of the psychic experiment are real, and real not only as my own personal experience, but as a collective experience which others also have. Later, I tried to demonstrate this in my scientific work, and I did it in my power to convey and I did all in my power to convey my intim to my intimates a new way of seeing things. I knew that if I did not succeed, I would be condemned to absolute isolation. It was only toward the end of the First World War that I gradually began to emerge from the darkness. Two events contributed to this. The first was that I broke with a woman who was determined to convince me that my fantasies had artistic value. The second and principal event was that I began to understand mandala drawings. This happened in 1918-19. I had painted the first mandala, footnote, reproduced as the frontispiece of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. In 1916, after writing Septem Sermones, naturally I had not then understood it. In 1918-19, I was at Chateau d'Oeil as commandant de région anglaise des internés de guerre. While I was there, I sketched every morning in a notebook a small circular drawing, a mandala, which seemed to correspond to my inner situation at the time. With the help of these drawings, I could observe my psychic transformations from day to day. Over time, for example, I received a letter from an aesthetic lady in which she again stubbornly maintained that the fantasies arising from my unconscious had artistic value and should be considered art. The letter got on my nerves. It was far from stupid and therefore dangerously persuasive. The modern artist, after all, seeks to create art out of the unconscious. The utilitarian and self-importance concealed behind this thesis touched a doubt in myself, namely my uncertainty as to whether the fantasies I was producing were really spontaneous and natural, and not ultimately my own arbitrary inventions. I was by no means free from the bigotry and hubris of consciousness, which wants to believe that any halfway decent inspiration is due to one's own merit, whereas inferior reactions come merely by chance, and even derived from alien sources. Out of this irritation and disharmony within myself there proceeded, the following day, a changed mandala. Part of the periphery had burst open, and the symmetry was destroyed. Only gradually to discover that what the mandala really is: formation, transformation, eternal mind's eternal recreation. Footnote: Faust, Part 2, translated by Philip. I'll read it again. Formation, transformation, eternal mind's eternal recreation. And that is the self, the wholeness of the personality, which, if all goes well, is harmonious, but which cannot tolerate self-deceptions. My mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which were presented to me anew each day. In them I saw the self, that is, my whole being, actively at work. To be sure, at first I could only dimly understand them, but they seemed to me highly significant, and I guarded them like precious pearls. I had the distinct feeling that they were something central, and in time I acquired through them a living conception of the self. The self, I thought, was like the monad, which I am, and which is my world. The mandala represents the monad, and corresponds to the microscopic nature of the psyche. I no longer knew how many mandalas I drew at the time. There were a great many. While I was working on them, the question arose repeatedly: what is this process leading to? What is its goal? From my own experience, I knew by now that I could not presume to choose a goal which would seem trustworthy to me. It had been proven to me that I had to abandon the idea of superordinate position of the ego. After all, I had been brought up short when I had attempted to maintain it. I had wanted to go on with a scientific analysis of myths which I had begun in Wandlungen and Symbole. This was still my goal, but I must not think of that. Was being compelled to go through this process of the unconscious. I had to let myself be carried along by its current without a notion of where it would lead me. When I began drawing the mandalas, however, I saw that everything, all the paths I had been following, all the steps I had taken, were leading back to a single point, namely to the midpoint. It became increasingly plain to me that the mandala is the center. It is the exponent of all paths. It is the path to the center, to individuation. During those years, between 1918 and 1920, I began to understand that the goal of the psychic development is the self. There is no linear evolution. It is only a circumambulation of the self. The uniform development exists at most only at the beginning. Later, everything points towards the center. This insight gave me stability, and gradually my inner peace returned. I knew that in finding the mandala as an expression of the self, I had attained what was for me the ultimate. Perhaps someone else knows more, but not I. Some years later, in 1927, I obtained confirmation of my ideas about the center and the self by way of a dream. I represented its essence in a mandala which I called Window on Eternity. The picture is reproduced in The Secret of the Golden Flower. A footnote concerning mandala symbolism in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Okay, footnote. A year later, I painted a second picture, likewise a mandala, and then footnote, the secret of, okay, sorry, I read the wrong footnote. Anyway, they're both about footnotes about the books where they're in. So a second, likewise a mandala with a golden castle in the center. When it was finished, I asked myself, why is this so Chinese? I was impressed by the form and choice of colors, which seemed to me Chinese, although there was nothing outwardly Chinese about it. Yet that was how it affected me. It was a strange coincidence that shortly afterwards I received a letter from Richard Wilhelm, enclosed of the manuscript of the Taoist alchemical treatise entitled The Secret of the Golden Flower, with a request that I write a commentary on it. I devoured the manuscript at once, for the text gave me undreamed of confirmation of my ideas about the mandala and the circumambulation of the center. That was the first event which broke through my isolation. I became aware of an affinity. I could establish ties with something and someone. In remembrances of this coincidence, this synchronicity, I wrote underneath the picture which had been made so Chinese an impression on me, quote, in 1928, when I painted this picture showing the golden, well-fortified castle, Richard Wilhelm in Frankfurt sent me the 1,000-year Chinese text on the yellow castle, the germ of the immortal body, unquote. This is the dream I mentioned earlier. I found myself in a dirty, sooty city. It was night and winter and dark and raining. I was in Liverpool. The number of Swiss, say half a dozen. I walked through the dark streets. I had the feeling that we were coming from the harbor, and that the real city was actually up above on the cliffs. We climbed up there. It reminded me of Basel, where the market is down below and where you go up through the Totengassen, alley of the dead, which leads to a plateau above and so to the Pepperplatz and the Peterskirche. When we reached the plateau, we found a broad square dimly illuminated by street lights, into which many streets converged. The various quarters of the city were lined radially around the square. In the center was a round pond, and in the middle of it a small island, while everything round about was obscured by rain, fog, smoke, and dimly lit darkness. The little island blazed with sunlight. On it stood a single tree, a magnolia, in a shower of reddish blossoms. It was as though the tree stood in the sunlight, and there was at the same time the source of light. My companions commented on the abominable weather, and obviously did not see the tree. They spoke of another Swiss who was living in Liverpool, and expressed surprise that he should have settled there. I was carried away by the beauty of the flowering tree and the sunlit island, and thought, I know very well why he has settled there. Here, I said, sorry, and I awoke. On one detail of the dream I must add a supplementary comment. The individual quarters of the city were themselves arranged radically around a central point. This point formed a small open square illuminated by a larger street lamp, and constituted a small replica of the island. I knew that the other Swiss lived in the vicinity of one of those secondary centers. This dream represented my situation at the time. I can still see the grayish-yellowish raincoats glistening in the wetness of the rain. Everything was extremely unpleasant, black and opaque, just as I felt then. But I had had a vision of unearthly beauty, and this was why I was able to live at all. Liverpool is the pool of life. The liver, according to an old view, is the seat of life, that which makes to live. This dream brought with it a sense of finality. I saw that here the goal had been revealed. One could not go beyond the center. The center is the goal, and everything is directed towards the center. Through the dream, I understood that the self is the principle and archetype of orientation and meaning. Therein lies its healing function. For me, this insight signified an approach to the center and therefore to the goal. Out of it emerged a first inkling of my personal myth. After this dream, I gave up drawing or painting mandalas. The dream depicted the climax of the whole process of development in consciousness. It satisfied me completely, for it gave a total picture of my situation. I had known to be sure that I was occupied with something important, but I still lacked understanding. There had been no one among my associates who could have understood. The clarification brought about by the dream made it possible for me to take an objective view to the things that filled my being. Without such a vision, I might perhaps have lost my orientation and been compelled to abandon my undertaking. But here the meaning had been made clear. When I parted from Freud, I knew I was plunged into the unknown. Beyond Freud, after all, I knew nothing. But I had taken the step into darkness. When that happens, then such a dream comes. One feels it as an act of grace. It had taken me virtually 45 years to distill within the vessel of it has taken me virtually 45 years to distill within the vessel of my scientific work the things I experienced and wrote down at that time. As a young man, my goal had been to accomplish something in my science. But then I hit upon this stream of lava. The heat of its fires reshaped my life. That was the primal stuff which compelled me to work upon it, and which my works are more or less successful endeavors to incorporate this incandescent matter into the contemporary picture of the world. The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them everything essential was decided. It all began there. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material which burst forth from the unconscious, and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work. Reader's commentary. One of the things I like about Michael Meade is he says that it's our job to be weird and to inspire people who are young to be weird, to become our true selves. Reading this chapter on Confrontation of the Unconscious, I've read it over a rather long time, so my memory of the beginning isn't as good, obviously, as my memory of the last part, is that um, that Jung really was weird and allowed himself to be completely weird. And that, I think, is part of that hero's journey that we all have to go through, because his mandalas, which, as we know, is part of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of completeness, that was his path, but we each have our own way of picturing or finding our path to our whole self. So I liked it that that it was really darkness for him, because that piece of like figuring out who your true self is really dark, and it may be something that's really obvious to everybody else and something that other people have gone through, but that's your path or my path, and um, that we do have to go into a really dark place to be able to come out and really see our own splendor, and then realize and live our own splendor of who we are, or what Mead would say our genius. So it was really interesting reading the sermons to the dead. It really sounded like somebody who's schizophrenic. So, and if you listen, I've talked about this before, but if you listen to schizophrenic people, like, they do make a certain sense. There is this sort of pinging about that it makes sense. I think Jung kept it together more than a lot of people do, but it just, you do kind of wonder, like, if you did spend your life's work diagnosing a schizophrenic person, if you could find some kind of amazing beauty in all of that, which I think probably is true. It's just your life's work probably isn't diagnosing somebody else, but instead yourself. Well, if you read or listened to this, if you listened this far, thank you.